Robert, I thought I'd start by asking you about your own personal story a little bit. Well, this is as much for an introduction to say the fact is Robert was born in Nottingham. He went to Cambridge, where he managed to be both editor of Varsity and president of the Union. I'm not sure anyone's managed to do that else. He went into television, then print journalism. He became political editor of The Observer at the age of just 30. And while he was doing this, he wrote several political and historical non-fiction books until the early 90s when you, Robert, wrote your first novel, Fatherland, a what-if historical novel supposing that Germany had won the Second World War. And it was a huge international success, selling millions of copies and translated into dozens of languages. But it was only the start of what has been a career that's provided so many of us with so much pleasure in reading your books. How did you come to decide to write a novel?
Well, I did a book called Selling Hitler, about the Hitler Diaries affair. And in the course of that, I read Hitler's Table Talk. And I hadn't really realized the extent to which there was so much planning for what the world would look like. The Table Talk was a lot of it in 1941 and 42 when Hitler thought he was going to win the war. So he would entertain everybody by laying out his vision of the future. And I thought this would make an interesting book. What would the world have looked like if Hitler had won? Because there were thousands of civil servants in Berlin working on post-war German planning. So I set out to write a kind of Baedeker guide to a world that never existed. And I thought I would put in the plans and the photographs of the models and all that, architectural models. But after a few months, I realized there were no people in this world. So it was a completely sterile environment. So I started to invent people. And I passed through the looking glass, as it were. Above all, I suppose, I wanted to answer the question of what it would have been like to have lived in a victorious Third Reich, and how the world would have handled the Holocaust, the crime of the disappearance, as it then would have been of the Jews in Europe. And that just lent itself to a sort of mystery novel, really, and so that I ended up writing fiction. And I've never stopped since, because I just found it so much more enjoyable. It seemed natural to me to do it. And I've gone on, and I think that was 25 years ago that Fatherland came out, and this is the first time I've gone back with this book to Nazi Germany. And
how did you find an agent? Did you write the whole book in advance? Did you do a proposal? How did that part of it work?
Well, these were the good old days. And a publisher heard what was in my mind. She'd brought out a few books by journalists. Tim Sebastian, the BBC correspondent in Poland, wrote quite a successful spy thriller. And she was looking for a journalist with an idea for a novel. So she said, I hear you've got an idea, and I told her. And she'd bought it over lunch. I never even had to write an outline. As I say, these were the days. I pocketed the first cheque. You know, the cheques come in three parts. The first one is on signature of the contract. And then I realized that I had to write the book. And I was convinced I would never do it, actually. And I started writing one Saturday afternoon. I remember the scene where the body is discovered from the lake or the river in Berlin, and I went on for about 4 or 5 pages through the following week, and I got all my characters in a room, but they didn't know why they were in the room, and I didn't know why they were in the room, and the whole thing stopped, and I really put it aside for about a year. And then I realized that if you're going to write a novel, you really have to know what's going to happen at the end. You have to have the whole structure of the book in your mind, and once I'd got that, then I went back to it. And then, to my astonishment, there was an auction in New York for it. Again, when only a third of it was written. And everything changed in my life at that point.
Did you then stop work on The Observer and start being a full-time writer?
I did, yes. I gave up in 97. I'd followed Tony Blair around in the election campaign. And he won, you may remember. And then he said, "Oh, well, I'll see you next month or whatever." I said, "No, you won't. I've got a book coming out, and I'll be busy with that." And I never. I did go back to journalism a bit, but off and on, and only when I couldn't get an idea for a novel.
And did you use a lot of, when you wrote Ghost, which of course is a veiled...
Be careful, there are probably a lot of lawyers in the house.
Okay. Yes, when you wrote Ghost, which is about a prime minister's having his biography written, do you feel you drew a lot on those particular months with Tony Blair?
Yes, I did. I realised I just got the chronology slightly wrong because Fatherland came out in '92. It was my third novel, Archangel, when I really gave up political journalism. I did draw on it a lot because, that seeing a politician on the edge of gaining power, seeing the way that he would prepare before he went out to make a big speech, seeing the way that people reacted to him. I got an insight into politics at the top that not many journalists get, and certainly very few novelists. And it has seen me and done me good, really, ever since. The Roman novels, Cicero, all of that. I think that the pursuit of power and the tricks of gaining power, of oratory, promises, betrayal, and all the rest of it hasn't changed very much over 2,000 years.
Good stuff. And so that's one of the sort of current contemporary politics. It's one of the topics you've discussed, but you've written about. And all your novels have been about sort of high politics and historical turning points or controversy. But two themes in particular you've returned to several times. And one is ancient Rome with Pompeii and your Cicero novels. And the other is the Second World War with Fatherland, Enigma, although that wasn't about Nazis, it's about UK, and now Munich. Do you see any parallels between the two periods?
Yes, I do, really. I think that both the 25 years of the end of the Roman Republic and the years from, well, I suppose really 1914 through to 1945, they are seems to me, the most tumultuous eras in human history in some ways. The world was broken and remade. Old societies and institutions crumbled. There were epic figures, total difference and dispute as to how societies should be organised and the basis of them. So I think both of them are times when the world was shaken up completely. So there is that similarity. And I think I certainly went to the Roman era with a deliberate intention of using it as an allegory for our own time. Pompeii was originally going to be a book about the United States and the Walt Disney Company, can you believe it? I had a dystopian vision of Walt Disney Company taking over the world, and I thought that I would try and write a sort of Fatherland what if about that. But then I checked into the Grand Floridian Hotel in Walt Disney World, and a couple came across the lobby, one in a black silk tuxedo with Mickey Mouse ears, and the bride in a bridal gown with white silk Mickey Mouse ears. And I said to the receptionist, "Where are they going?" And she said, "They're going to get married on the platform overlooking Sleeping Beauty's castle." So I said, "Does this happen all the time?" And she gave me a pitying look and said, "Every 30 minutes." And at that point, I realized I couldn't satirize. Any feeble invention that I could come up with would be nothing compared to the original. So I flew home disconsolate, and then I saw that there was a new research on the destruction of Pompeii. So I thought I'll make Pompeii my celebration, Florida, Walt Disney town, and I'll make Rome my Washington. And I liked that world so much that when I came to the end of writing Pompeii, as you said, I was a political editor. I'd always wanted to write a novel about politics. But I didn't think that I could improve on the bizarre nature of the original characters in politics, in fiction. Excuse me for saying this. That was then. That was before we got to Trump and the rest of it. So I thought, well, I'll write a novel about politics and universalize it by setting it in the ancient world. And all those figures who knew one another and were sometimes even in the same room, like Caesar, Pompey, Crassus, Cato, Cicero. I just thought that it would just make an extraordinary epic novel, or three novels, as it turned out.
And so you've sort of touched briefly on the complexity of political figures. Is there anything, because obviously your novels are centred around big political figures, is there anything in sort of beyond that in particular that draws you to them or makes you want to fictionalise them?
Well, I was just always interested all my life in politics. The very first piece of work, essay, that I ever wrote at the age of 6, my parents went to the school parents' evening and everyone else had written, what I did on my holidays and so on. And I'd written why me and my dad don't like Sir Alec Douglas Hume. And this, apart from the improvement in the grammar, I've got on writing the same thing ever since. And indeed, in this novel, I actually have Alec Douglas Hume in it.
Yes.
So I've really achieved my dream.
Yes. And you never attempted to go into politics yourself?
No, maybe when I was much younger, as a student, possibly, but the moment I saw it close up, I knew that it was not for me, and I'm very glad. I think it's quite important in life to realise what you shouldn't do as much as what you should. And for this novel, I went and sat. I was very kindly shown around Downing Street after 6 o'clock and to the Prime Minister's room in the House of Commons and the Foreign Office and so on. And I realised that I was so glad that I'd never pursued that career. There was something about it that I would much rather observe. And therefore I write about politics, I hope, with some sympathy. I mean, portraits of people like Cicero and Chamberlain, I dislike the determination to turn them all into villains, all politicians. I rather admire politicians for what they do and the inevitable failure and tragedy of politics. I find rather moving, and so I've always tried to write about it from the inside. I think novels are best written from the inside. I did a novel last year about the Catholic Church, the election of a pope, and I didn't want to do it from outside, but from within, with some sympathy. And these issues of power, be it in the Catholic Church or in ancient Rome or in Britain, and the sort of people who seek power and what it does to you and its destructive qualities, that is my theme. Others write about love and proper, sensible things, but I'm drawn to this.
No, and you tackle it very well. And so you think that writing, what's interesting is the fact that you choose to write these as fiction as opposed to non-fiction. I was thinking in terms of Cicero, Munich, the Dreyfus affair. And what do you think that allows you to do? I mean, because you could easily have written these as non-fiction.
Well, I think that it's I feel like a sort of traveller in the eras or the periods that I write about. I like to really get a sense of absolutely what it would be like, what the weather was like, where you would sit, what you would eat, who you would see, and to live it almost in virtual reality. And I think that means switching on your imagination and empathy with characters, creating characters people care about, inserting them into these worlds. And for me, it's just much more exciting. I mean, when I stopped writing non-fiction and started to write the first few pages of Fatherland, it was like getting off a bike and getting into a helicopter. I mean, there was just so much more you could do and swerve around and invent, and things appeared. It was phantasmagorical, really, and I was completely sober, but I enjoyed it. It was intoxicating, and I don't think I'll ever write non-fiction again now. People say to you, "Oh, don't you miss journalism?" But I don't, to be absolutely honest.
And so let's move on to Munich, which is your latest book, and is, as I'm sure you're all going to discover shortly, clutching your books, of course, unputdownable and fascinating, because it does bring to life, from this internal point of view, a historical event which still resonates today. We can't forget about Munich, even decades on. And two principal historical figures in your book are, of course, Chamberlain and Hitler. Can you tell us a little about the decisions you made in building up your portrait of?
Yes, well, Chamberlain was quite relatively easy to write about because, as far as I know, maybe someone here can put me right, but I don't think any novel has ever had Chamberlain in it as a character. He's certainly not close up. So I felt that was virgin territory I was going into, and it was rather exciting because for all his faults, and he certainly had many, and for all the ultimate failure of his career, he's rather different to what people imagine. I mean, he was a much more tough, calculating character, not at all a sort of a feeble, elderly dupe, which is what most people seem to regard him as. So that was interesting to write about him, and I felt I had something newish to say. Hitler is a nightmare to write about. Just as when he hosts interview in any movie apart from Downfall, I don't think I've ever seen a convincing portrayal of him because the figure is so iconic and in our heads that any attempt to put him on celluloid or in a book is almost doomed to failure. And I knew that this would be the great problem with Munich. You couldn't write a novel about the Munich Agreement and not have him in it. But how did I get him in? And I had a real crisis, actually, the first time I have my German figure. The book is told, I should perhaps explain, through the eyes of two characters. One is who were both at Oxford in the early 1930s. One is called Hugh Leggett, who's a very clever Balliol undergraduate who then takes the Foreign Office exam and ends up in Downing Street as a junior private secretary in 1938. And the other is a Adam von Trott-like character. An interesting one should be here because Adam von Trott came here very often. He was a great friend of the Astor family as a young man. This figure, he goes into the German foreign ministry and ends up on Hitler's train traveling to Munich, just as my British character flies on Chamberlain's plane. And so Leggett, the Englishman, sees Chamberlain at first hand, and my German had to see Hitler at close hand. But when I came to the first entrance, as it were, of Hitler, I actually had to stop writing and phone my editor in an alarm and say, I can't go on with this. It just sounded ridiculous, to go into a room and there's this figure, Hitler, there. And she caught the next train down and talked me off the ledge, gave me a large glass of Pinot Grigio, and I returned, and I solved the problem by not having him actually meet Hitler, by being left outside the door. Always incredibly effective in fiction, is if the door slams in your face, and so you didn't see him. And then the next time Hitler appears, he's just coming down a platform, station platform, and all you see is a photographer running backwards and the entourage sweeping past the window where my character is waiting on the train. And then finally I had to bring Hitler in, but it's sort of unexpected because my character is summoned to just present a document to him. And he's hard. I mean, I went and saw his apartment in Munich, which very few people ever see because it's now a police presidium building. And it was just startling how little changed it was. And one really could feel his ghost in it. I hope the portrayal is fairly accurate, and I hope it's a bit different perhaps to the way he's normally shown, but that was hard. I mean, in Fatherland, Hitler's never see Hitler. You never see any prominent Nazi. But in this book, I couldn't avoid it.
No, and you do it very well. You bring in sort of mannerisms and details that absolutely make this dictator, evil man, leap from the pages. What was it about is it called the Führerbau, where he was, that made you feel so much that Hitler was there?
Well, the Führerbau, again, it's an irony that the cradle of Nazism, Munich, of all the major German cities, is the least affected by bombing. And anyone who's been to Munich will know that a lot of the Nazi buildings still stand. The House of German Art, for instance, and the Raubal, which was a sort of Hitler's, I don't know what one would call it, cultural palace. It was where he assembled his art collection, and it's a bit like a sort of national theatre in a way, with a foyer and great curling red marble staircases, and it's all untouched. And I sat in Hitler's study in front of the fireplace where Chamberlain, Hitler, Daladier, and Mussolini all sat. And the panelling, the wood panelling, the floor, the fireplace, it's all still there. It's used as the Faculty of Music of Munich University. But you really feel the ghosts. And I went down into where the kitchens were, these huge dining rooms there, smoking rooms, oddly, even though Hitler detested smoking. Maybe these rooms were specially set aside so they didn't have to see anyone doing it. And yeah, you can imagine him very easily walking around. The most chilling thing, I think, was in the apartment was to see the proximity of his bedroom to his niece's, which were linked by a connecting bathroom. And the staff lived right at the far end of this apartment. And there was no doubt when I saw that, and when Chamberlain went to Hitler's apartment, the bedroom in which the niece had shot herself in 1931 was still a shrine. It had been left untouched, with all her clothes laid out and her perfume bottles still around and her letters still on the desk. I mean, it really is remarkable to think of Chamberlain entering that apartment, accompanied only by Alec Douglas Hume, no other official, and sitting a few yards away from this scene with Hitler. I defy anyone to go and see that and not feel some electric charge from the past.
And can you tell us a little about the story of Hitler and his niece?
Well, yes, I can tell you what little we know is that they went around together. He as the uncle, she as the niece. But quite a few of the entourage made salty jokes about, oh, I wish I had a niece like that, kind of thing. And the relationship was obviously, having seen it, I think it must have been sexual. But if it wasn't sexual, it was certainly unhealthy and stifling. And in due course, she shot herself there. There were lots of rumours she might have been murdered or whatever, but probably she killed herself. And it was a huge scandal. It threatened his career. And it said it changed his personality, that he was if you can imagine, of a slightly sunnier disposition before she killed herself, and afterwards was a much more remote and distant and difficult figure. He swapped almost immediately to a Geli Raubal lookalike in Eva Braun, who fulfilled the same sort of function as a sort of, not a dumb blonde exactly, but more of a sort of, certainly a little woman rather than an equal partner. Eva Braun is not in the novel, I'm afraid.
So one of the challenges of historical fiction is, of course, marrying the fact with the animation, and how you take the true story and what you add on top of this. And this is obviously a challenge, particularly so in Munich, as it's, as I said, still such a sensitive subject. I wonder if a good way into this might be for you to read a passage now from Munich.
You can't actually remember the page.
93.
93, thank God. Thank God you've remembered. Yes, well, this is just a small example of just going inside Downing Street and being with Chamberlain. The novel takes place over 4 days. The first day, the Tuesday, is the day that the talks collapsed in Berlin, and Hitler said that he would be moving into Czechoslovakia, mobilizing the army on the Wednesday, I think. And that night, the novel opens with my character, Hugh Leggett, having lunch with his wife in the Ritz, and in Green Park they were digging slit trenches, and gas masks were being issued all over the country. And Chamberlain that night broadcast the famous faraway people of whom we know nothing. And my figure, Hugh Leggett, is a junior private secretary who had to stay up late into the night helping Chamberlain make his plans for his speech to the Commons the next day, which had been recalled for the occasion to hear the gravity of the international crisis. So duty secretaries then, and I think still now, sleep over in Downing Street. So Leggett sleeps up in the attic and the next morning comes downstairs, and the private secretaries were quite devoted to Chamberlain, but he could be stiff, certainly to begin with, and not know anyone's name or be too shy to use it. And my figure has not been working with Chamberlain very long, and this is almost the first sort of proper interaction between them. So it's about sort of 9 o'clock in the morning, and Leggett comes downstairs. The narrow stairs led down to a dining room outside the Prime Minister's flat, and from there down to the anteroom next to Chamberlain's study. Leggett's intention was to slip out to the Lions' Corner House near Trafalgar Square. He could be there and back in 30 minutes. But before he could reach the main staircase, he heard a door open behind him, and a woman's voice called out, "Mr. Leggett, good morning." He stopped and turned to face her. "Good morning, Mrs. Chamberlain." Her costume was funereal, charcoal grey and black with a necklace of large beads of jet. She said, "Did you manage to get some sleep?" "Yes, thank you." "Come and have some breakfast." "Oh, I was just about to go out." "Don't be silly. We always give the duty secretary breakfast." She peered at him myopically. "It's Hugh, isn't it?" "That's right. But really, nonsense. There's such a crowd gathering outside already. It will be much easier for you to eat here." She took his arm and gently tugged him after her. They passed through the state drawing rooms, watched by various Whig and Tory statesmen looking down their noses at them from heavy gilt frames. To his surprise, she continued to hold on to him. They might have been fellow guests at a country house weekend going into dinner together. "I'm so grateful for all that you young men do for my husband." Her tone was confiding. "You've no idea how much you lighten his burden. And don't say you're just doing your job. I know the personal cost of public service." She opened the door to the dining room. It was not the grand official one, but the more intimate, wood-panelled room, with a table for 12. At the far end, reading the Times, was the Prime Minister. He looked up at his wife and smiled. "Good morning, my dear." He nodded at Leggett. "Good morning." He resumed reading. Mrs. Chamberlain gestured to a side table where half a dozen dishes with silver covers were being kept warm on a hot plate. "Do please help yourself. Coffee?" "Thank you." She handed him a cup and went and sat next to the Prime Minister. Leggett lifted the nearest cover. The greasy, sweet smell of the bacon reminded him how hungry he was. He went along the table, filling his plate, scrambled eggs, mushrooms, sausages, black pudding. When he sat down, Mrs. Chamberlain smiled at the size of his breakfast. "Are you married, Hugh?" "Yes, Mrs. Chamberlain." "Any children?" "A boy and a girl." "Exactly the same as us. How old?" "They're 3 and 2. "Oh, how wonderful. Ours are much older. Dorothy is 27. She was recently married. Frank is 24. Do you like this coffee?" Leggett took a sip. It was disgusting. "It's very good, thank you. I make it with chicory." The Prime Minister rustled his paper slightly and grunted. Mrs. Chamberlain fell quiet and poured herself some tea. Leggett resumed eating. For several minutes there was silence. "Ah, now this is interesting." The Prime Minister suddenly lifted his paper and folded it to the page he'd been reading. "Could you make a note of this?" Leggett quickly put down his knife and fork and took out his notebook. The Prime Minister brought the print up close to his eyes. "I shall need to write a letter to a Mr. G.J. Scoley of 38 Dysart Avenue, Kingston upon Thames." "Yes, Prime Minister." Leggett was bewildered. "He has a letter to the editor printed. In the spring of this year, I was observing a blackbird with a nest of eggs in a steep bank. Upon my approach, each day the sitting bird would allow me to observe her at a few feet distant, and then one morning her familiar figure was missing. On peering over the bank, I found her 4 young chicks, cold and lifeless in the nest. A thin trail of blackish breast feathers led me down the bank to a small bush, under which I discovered the mangled remains of my old blackbird. And intermingled in that trail of blackbird's feathers were a few others. those which could only have come from the breast and flanks of a little owl. The Prime Minister tapped the paper with his finger. I have observed exactly the same behaviour by the little owls at Chequers. Mrs. Chamberlain said, "Oh, Neville, really, as if Hugh hasn't got enough to do." Leggett said, "Actually, I believe it was my grandfather on my mother's side who helped introduce the little owl to the British Isles." "Did he really?" For the first time, the Prime Minister looked at him with genuine interest. "Yes, he brought several pairs back with him from India." "What year would this have been?" "I should think about 1880. "So in barely more than 50 years, this little bird has spread all over southern England. That is something to celebrate." "Not if you're a blackbird, apparently," said Mrs. Chamberlain. "Do you have time for a walk, Neville?" She looked across the table at Leggett. "We always take a walk after breakfast." The Prime Minister put down his paper. "Yes, I need some air, but not the park, I'm afraid, not today. There are too many people. It will have to be the garden. Why don't you come with us?" "Hugh?"
Excellent.
And, just on the point of fact, that letter was in the Times that morning, the morning of the great crisis. And Chamberlain famously had written to the editor of the Times as Prime Minister, observing various birds in St James's Park. And Mrs. Chamberlain did serve disgusting coffee made with chicory. So, you could take a few bits of fact and then you turn it into a scene. That is a pleasure, I think, that is denied a proper, serious scholar. You couldn't do that, but a novelist has the rein to do that.
And of course, one of the great things that you can do in a historical novel that you can't do in non-fiction is dialogue. Are there any secrets you can share about how you create such good dialogue?
Well, dialogue, it really needs to do several things at once. It needs to sort of take the story forward. It needs to be interesting in itself and reveal something of the character. You should try and get at least 3 things operating with dialogue if you can do it. I think dialogue is, in some ways, the easiest thing to write, and yet at the same time, it's where you can easily become very flaccid. You can write pages and pages of it, and it becomes very boring. I always try to make my books not boring. I dislike boring stuff in books, and I dislike guessing what's going to come. So. It's like a constant parlour game with the reader of trying to do things to just keep people interested as much as anything else, or keep me interested, and if I'm interested, then I hope the reader will be.
And which indeed we are. And so what do you think? Do you think that the fact that Chamberlain was worrying about owls and blackbirds on the morning of the crisis, what does that reveal?
Well, Chamberlain, I wanted to really contrast Chamberlain and Hitler. Not, I suppose, in some ways they need much contrasting. Chamberlain, I really missed a trick, incidentally, and that passage will alter in the future editions, because, in fact, Chamberlain's first granddaughter had been born 10 days earlier. She wrote to me about the book and said, because she felt that her grandfather had been badly treated, and she'd suffered all her life from pejorative references to him. And she said, "I was always known in the family as the Munich baby." And which is interesting itself, but even more interesting when you bear in mind that when Chamberlain met Hitler on the Friday morning in Hitler's apartment, the first thing he started talking about was the spectacle of babies in gas respirators. And again, I don't think that connection has ever been made, but it must have been on his mind. Of course, Hitler stared at him blankly. But in those small details of the love of birds and family, one can find something about a character. In other ways, he was oddly quite like Hitler. He was messianic and played his cards very close to his chest, and nobody really knew what was in his mind. He was vain, both in terms of his dominance over his colleagues and in small physical ways. For instance, like Hitler, he didn't like to wear glasses in public. And so when he made the famous speech at Heston Aerodrome, reading out the piece of paper, if you see him, he flourishes it, and then he has to read it like this, flapping in the rain. interesting, but an interesting figure, I think.
And what other sort of are there any other elements of research from Munich that you found particularly surprising?
Well, both big geopolitical things which I hadn't been aware of, and smaller things. Smaller things, the Lockheed aircraft, for instance, that Chamberlain flew in, depressurized, bouncing around at 7,000 feet. A very uncomfortable way to travel, especially in late September. And if you see pictures of it, it's like this at rest. You know, it's not like a modern aircraft where you get on and you walk down the aisle. Getting on one of these planes, you had to sort of pull yourself up to sit at the front of it, and only 14 passengers on it. And I took great pleasure in finding who had been on the plane and what they were like. This small group of Foreign Office officials. So lots of tiny details, and they had a hamper from the Savoy full of smoked salmon sandwiches and grouse sandwiches. I must say, if I was going to meet Hitler, I wouldn't want a grouse sandwich to start with, but still. And bottles of claret at sort of, 9 o'clock in the morning. And then bigger things which historians perhaps knew, but I didn't. For instance, that the British and the French had told the Czechs, even before Munich, that if there was a war, that they would not restore Czechoslovakia to the old borders, that the Sudeten Germans could not continue to be within Czechoslovakia. And that was kept quiet at the time, and one could see why, because it would have, what a strange thing to go to war, to throw the whole British Empire into a war less than 20 years after the last catastrophe, for an issue in which you don't propose to put it right even when you're victorious. Small things like that, diplomatic things, they seem small, but actually, obviously, they were huge at the time. And I really wanted to, Munich failed and appeasement failed, but the epigraph that I put at the front of the book from F.W. Maitland, the historian, you must remember that things now in the past were once in the future. If you can wind back and imagine what the world would have looked like behind the desk of a British Prime Minister in 1938, without all the hindsight that we now have of the doomed nature of appeasement and of the Holocaust and of the real nature of what was to come in the Nazi regime, and if you can try and engage with it sympathetically, then I think that is something worth doing. Because, as you say, Munich and appeasement still have a huge hang-on in the modern world. And every time there's an international crisis, Saddam Hussein, General Galtieri, Assad, Gaddafi, always it's Munich and appeasement and dealing with dictators. And it's not necessarily a helpful analogy to compare the problems facing the British and the French in 1938 with those we face with a much smaller figure today.
And so the sort of majority mood prior to Munich in Britain was for appeasement.
Well, I think most people just got on with their lives, as they do, as people always have and always do. I think there was obviously great distaste for the Nazi regime. But I live in a small village in Berkshire, and the war memorial there, which I pass every day, with maybe 50 names on it, many of them from the same family. Bear in mind that had happened less than 20 years before, so the equivalent to when Princess Diana was killed, to now. Imagine it. And imagine when, out of nowhere, really the Czech crisis blew up, because that really happened over the space of about a fortnight. And this sudden realization, the leaflet was distributed to every home about building your bomb shelter in your house and gas-proofing your windows, and the respirators issued, and every child to be evacuated from London, because they thought it would be like we think nuclear war would be. They thought that London would be in ruins within a week or two. So when Chamberlain was able to say, I'm going to see Hitler and I think we can stop this, the outbreak of relief, I think you had to have been there to believe it. Stefan Zweig wrote brilliantly about this. He said, really, you don't understand what it was like. And the crowds when Chamberlain took off from Heston airfield, and it was an airfield incidentally, just a grass runway bouncing along, and flew and took off out in all the gardens of those houses down near Heston service station. Everyone was out in their gardens waving, and the traffic was stopped for a mile in either direction, motorists looking up. And when he landed, there were thousands, and it took an hour and a half to get back into central London, and the King and Queen took him out onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace, and it was like a royal wedding. The Mall was jammed with people. So, that was how people felt at the time, an overwhelming sense of relief.
And how long did that take before it changed?
Oh, not very long. I think, first of all, Chamberlain knew the moment he said, "Peace for our time." Alec Douglas Hume told me the moment he pulled his head back in from the window in Downing Street, he'd said it to the crowd outside. He said, "I shouldn't have done that." And he actually apologised in the House of Commons on the following week for the words, which he said, please don't read too much into words which were said in the heat of the moment, having driven through thousands of cheering people. And within 2 or 3 weeks, Hitler was making a very bellicose speech, and then there were Kristallnacht in November, I think, which was designed to, show that the regime was not going soft. On the contrary, it was going to get harder. The other side of all this is that Hitler, I think it's hard not to agree with scholars who now see that Hitler regarded Munich as a setback. I mean, he wanted the war, and he disliked this meddly old man, the old arsehole, as he called Chamberlain, coming in and getting in the way, and really effectively meeting all the demands that he'd made, which were his pretext for war. And he'd never made the mistake of giving out all his demands again. He kept them vague so that they couldn't be met. And he was infuriated by the reception that Chamberlain got in Munich. It was the climax of the Oktoberfest, and the city was filled with people in folk dress, dirndls and lederhosen, and there was an Umpar band outside Chamberlain's hotel room, and the crowds 10 or 12 deep, and all the newspaper reports agree he got much louder cheers than Hitler did. And it was, in a way, 6 years into the Nazi regime, a kind of peace demonstration. I mean, obviously you couldn't demonstrate against Hitler, but you could, by doing an even more noisy demonstration for a British Prime Minister, make it clear what you thought about the idea of war. And Hitler, for 2 weeks, was in a foul mood after Munich, according to Albert Speer, and then there was a dinner party where he finally let fly and said, the German people have been duped, and by Chamberlain, of all people. I'd always wanted to write the novel. I'd always seen this English character with Chamberlain. 30 years ago, when I started working on this, I saw that figure, but I could never see the German figure. But when I read, it's in Joachim Fest's diary of working with Speer, because he ghost wrote Speer's memoir, Inside the Third Reich. When I read that, I saw that, of course, I must have a counterpart German figure who can tell the other half of the story. So Chamberlain with Leggett and Hitler with Hartmann, who finds himself with him quite often.
Interestingly, if you were still a political editor, how would you write up these two aides, Leggett and Hartmann?
Well, political journalists don't write about these civil servants very often. They are... that's what's interesting. They are the hidden movers. I mean, whatever is going on in Brexit, a lot of it is being done by people who we've never even heard of their names. And they'll be meeting together. And, it would be fascinating to write about one of those figures who are often more interesting than the ministers. I hope to God they're more interesting than the ministers anyway.
Well, so that was exactly what you could do with fiction. Yeah.
Yes, you can take minor figures. It's the sort of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern idea. People on the fringes of events, secretaries, ghostwriters, translators. I love those figures who are close to power, witness it, maybe even change things, and we don't know who they are. They are great hidden agents for a novelist to write about, and again, something that's very hard for scholars, because a lot of these figures did not leave many papers. Cecil Syers was the private secretary who actually flew on the plane with Chamberlain. I have him bumped off, not literally, figuratively. I mean, I get my man on the plane instead. But Syers, I don't think, left any papers or any detailed memoir of flying with Chamberlain. And we have Alec Douglas Hume went into the apartment, Hitler's apartment, but he was very laconic. I mean, he wrote very little. What he did say was fascinating. In particular, he said that Chamberlain said, one thing I didn't know, to go an earlier question, your question about what didn't I know. I didn't know that the famous piece of paper was actually mostly Hitler's own words from a speech delivered at the beginning of the week, saying he only wanted peace between Britain and Germany, and he'd signed the Anglo-German naval agreement, and he'd hoped that would be the way forward. And Chamberlain really got him to sign his own words. He said to Alec Douglas Hume that he thought he would stick to it, but if he didn't, it would unite people, the British people, and might bring the Americans in. And he said, therefore, I propose to make a big thing of it when I get back to London. And boy, did he make a big thing of it. And of course, with disastrous consequences for his reputation. But you see, it's a more subtle and interesting thing if he got Hitler to sign his own words and then consciously waved it in front of the newsreel cameras so that it would be an indelible image for people, and which was important in 1940 because people would see that we had tried everything possible and he broke his word, and therefore there was no point in listening to peace terms. It would be useless. And Chamberlain supported Churchill in not even listening to what Hitler's peace terms would be. And his own experience at Munich, I think, was crucial in that. Crucial within government, but also crucial for everybody in feeling that this thing had to be fought through. And the argument for Munich is I don't think there would have been that feeling if we'd gone to war in 1938 over Czechoslovakia. I mean, it was a necessary thing we probably had to go through in order to stand united and eventually win.
Well, thank you, Robert. We have time now for some questions, which I know you are keen to.
Yes, of course. Very happy to. Whoever.
Which historical analogy would you use to describe the rise of Trump?
Well, the Emperor Nero springs to mind. And maybe he'll be playing the fiddle while we all burn. The trouble is, you see, with the Trump is a nightmare for novelists, or particularly for political novelists, because you cannot improve on the reality, and you cannot really. There's nothing you can invent that would be more bizarre, and so often this is one of the reasons why I like writing historical fiction and interweaving fact and fiction. And whenever there's something in one of my novels that is outlandish and unbelievable and bizarre, then that is real. And whenever it's dull and prosaic and just as you'd expect, that's what I've invented. And that's almost invariably the case. But how I'd put Trump in a novel, I don't know. I just hope I'm around to be able to try it in about 4 years' time.
How deeply do you research before you actually start writing, Robert?
It depends. For the Cicero books, I did 2 years of nothing but research, but that was research that had to cover a trilogy. That was a very enjoyable period. For this novel, I'd been interested. I made a documentary for the BBC 30 years ago for the 50th anniversary of Munich. So I had a lot of the things in my head. Generally, I should say about 6 months. The Dreyfus book was 6 months research. So was the Conclave. And obviously, The Ghost, much less. I went to Martha's Vineyard, and that was about it. The rest of it I had in my head. as it were.
Hi. Obviously, lots of your work has been made, well, at least 2 of your novels have been made into films that I know of, and I'm very much looking forward to the Royal Shakespeare Company production of your Cicero novels. I wondered how involved you get in the process of those adaptations and whether you're generally happy with the end result.
Well, Kingsley Amis said, "Take the money and run," was his advice to anyone for selling work, and you can't complain about what follows. My brother-in-law is also a novelist. He says if you complain about what's been done to your work, it's a bit like selling your house, then going back 6 months later and complaining that the kitchen's been knocked through. You know, every book that I've written, including this one, has been sold for film or television, and a lot of them are now in the process of being worked through. Some I've been heavily involved in. I wrote the screenplay for The Ghost, so that's my favourite adaptation, obviously. But others have been disastrous. Fatherland, I know some people quite like the film version of Fatherland, but I can't stand it. It was bought by Mike Nichols, so it should have been good, but I had lunch with him in the Russian tea room in New York. I'd only just, my first novel, I was 34, and Mike Nichols was saying how he was going to hire David Hare to do the screenplay, and it was going to be huge and so on. And then the Columbia TriStar studio did their research into what did the teenage audience think of the idea of a book in which Hitler had won the war, a film, and they didn't even know there'd been a war, let alone who'd won it. They truly didn't even know what the Holocaust was. And so that it rapidly started to dwindle at that point and became an HBO movie. And Mike Nichols was a great friend of the Kennedy family. So the idea that Joe Kennedy would do a deal with Hitler, that had to go. And then he didn't like the idea of a hostile relationship between a father and son. He said the American audiences would never take that. So that became then kind of like a buddy. You know, they're great buddies. Joe Kennedy's a great man, and you know the whole thing started to crumble, and it's pretty grim. The worst thing was I went with my wife to see the filming in Prague, which stood in for Berlin, and one weekend, spring weekend, and everyone else on the plane was going for a sort of romantic weekend, and we arrived and it was 1,000 people dressed as SS men and giant swastikas flying all above the city. It was excruciatingly embarrassing, the whole... So, I find it's interesting. The play is a completely different experience. I've never had anything turned into a play before. And that's a much more living thing because there's the director and the playwrights there and the actors are commenting and, that will be fascinating to see what they do with that.
Thank you. Hello?
Hi. Oh, there. This gentleman here? Is that the gentleman has the mic, I think, so.
Hello.
Oh, the mic there, sorry. Who goes first, Francis?
I don't know. That gentleman, then this one.
Yes, Thank you. Given that a certain Andrew Roberts rips the Churchill film about D-Day to pieces because of its historical inaccuracy, how important is it to you that professional historians basically give the historical parts of it an A grade?
Well, the historical profession, in my experience, divides between those who are generous and who want to encourage wider reading in history. Particularly found this with people with the Cicero novels, Mary Beard, for instance, very encouraging. Others very hostile, and that's been a pattern. I can't take too much notice of it, really, to be honest. I try and get things accurate. I try to always make it a rule that anything that happens in the novel that I invent could have happened. I tried never to put in anything that I know didn't happen. And I tried to remain faithful to the facts. For instance, in Enigma, We all know the famous story that Churchill let the Germans bomb Coventry in order to avoid revealing that we were breaking their codes. The U-boat convoy battle, which enabled us to get back into the U-boat codes and to therefore win the Battle of the Atlantic, we got back paradoxically because it was such a huge disaster. There were so many sightings, so many reports of sinkings, that there was enough material to break the codes again. It would have been quite easy for me to make it look as though the British had deliberately sacrificed convoys for the wider purpose of winning the Battle of the Atlantic by breaking the codes. I wouldn't do that, though, because I think that's a libel on history, and I would try and avoid that if I possibly can. In the end, what you do, I think the thing above all that one does is one imparts a shape to the material, and one is much more concise. The Dreyfus Affair, it's a long book, that novel, An Officer and a Spy, the longest novel that I wrote, but it's this big, and the Dreyfus Affair is this big, and I had to leave out a lot, and that probably is the main distortion, is condensation, I would say.
You said at the beginning that quite early on in your novel you have the structure fairly well sorted. How does that pan out?
Well, one has to, a novel recounts something that has already happened. It's like an incident, like a traffic accident or an assassination or something that's occurred, and then you come along as a novelist and you describe what it is that has happened. There are many ways you can do that. You can start at the end and work back to the beginning, or in the middle, or wherever. But the thing itself has already occurred. And I think it would be very hard to write a novel like A Game of Consequences, in which you simply have no idea what's going to happen from day to day. In the first page of Munich is the DNA for the whole of the rest of the book. And in particular, in fact, Hitler's speech. So you have Legget waiting for his wife, the slit trenches being dug, and he's reading Hitler's speech. In particular, the passages which are then going to feature at the very end of the novel. It's great if you can put all that on the first page. Having said that, if you try and have follow rigorously a set plan, the novel will be dead on arrival, because it has to be organic. Characters do arise, and there's a secretary in this to whom Legget dictates Chamberlain's broadcast about a faraway people of whom we know nothing. And in my plan, that's it. He just dictates it to the secretary. But as I was writing it, she turned around and made some clever remark to him, and I knew that character there would have to come back in again, and she does throughout the novel. And that's what makes it interesting as a writer, that things change and develop. I didn't know the twist in The Ghost, for instance, until halfway through writing the book. Similarly with Conclave. These things come as you work. So it's a bit of both is the proper answer.
This gentleman at the front for the last question.
Has it occurred to you, I'm sure it has, that how your book intensifies the dilemma for the post-war generation, if not the millennials, about which side they would have been on in the late 1930s? I mean, hitherto everyone was against appeasement. You couldn't dare say you were an appeaser at all. You were condemned, and you had to be on the side of the strong men, and Chamberlain was the loser. But supposing Chamberlain actually was the really hard man who nearly outwitted Hitler, doesn't that change a lot of people's thinking about the word appeasement? Still a dirty word. Maybe it shouldn't be so dirty.
Well, this is, to me, there's the very heart and excitement of writing these sorts of books, because Churchill, who liked Chamberlain, actually, the two men got on quite well. He said, poor Neville will come badly out of history. I know, because I will write the history. And Chamberlain was caught between the Tory party that wanted to disavow their total support for Chamberlain, really, it was right up to 1940, and the Labour Party, who really disgracefully had opposed every measure of rearmament Chamberlain had ever put in, denounced him as a warmonger, and voted against conscription in 1939, can you believe? But nevertheless, Michael Foote, who worked for Beaverbrook, Archipisa, wrote the guilty men this pamphlet attacking Chamberlain. So he was destroyed from both sides, from right and left, and he's really been treated with contempt ever since. And people I talk to, a lot of them who remember that time do just feel relief. They just remember the sensation of relief. And when one looks at it, I personally think without 1938, no 1940, I think it would have been really, war might have had a very different outcome if we tried to fight it in 38. Certainly that was Hitler's view. Right to the end of his life, he was saying, we should have fought in 1938. September 38 was the perfect time. I mean, he said that. He thought all through the war he was a year out. He was a year behind where he should have been. And therefore, I think we should think about 1938 because there's so much about 1940. It's become the great fetish of this country. The Dunkirk movie, which I liked, a new movie with Gary Oldman as Churchill, which I'm sure will be very good. But there is more to our history than 1940, and if that's all that we guide ourselves and know ourselves by, then I think we're in danger of slipping into self-delusion. And people say appeasement. I was trying to think, how could I convey what appeasement would be that isn't loaded? And it occurred to me, and it's not an exact analogy, but the Good Friday Agreement was appeasement. The peace process in Northern Ireland was taking violent, psychopathic criminals who'd killed your soldiers and civilians and who had tried to kill you as a government, and nevertheless saying, all right, we will do the hypocritical thing. We will talk to them. What are the grievances? Can we remove them? Can we bring an era of peace? Of course, it worked. So no one denounces John Major and Tony Blair, or very few people do, as appeasers. In Neville Chamberlain's case, it didn't. But nevertheless, having spent 30 years looking at it, I think he deserves a bit more credit than he gets, quite frankly.